When most people talk about Starfleet, they talk about its ideals: exploration, diplomacy, scientific discovery. They imagine starships as symbols of unity and progress, sleek vessels gliding through the galaxy with a kind of effortless grace. But nothing about Starfleet has ever been effortless. Behind every starship, behind every diplomatic triumph, every deep space exploration mission is an industrial machine the Federation has spent 2 centuries downplaying, ignoring, or outright mythologizing into irrelevance. Starfleet likes to say it's not a military, that it serves exploration first, that its ships aren't built for war. Because exploration on an interstellar scale requires something that's far less poetic, but far more important: infrastructure. And a staggering amount of it. Shipyards, foundries, drydocks, warp core fabrication facilities, dilithium refineries, antimatter production reactors. Entire planetary economies geared towards the single purpose of keeping Starfleet functioning. And yet, the Federation rarely acknowledges this side of itself. It prefers a myth of abundance, replicators for everything, needs met automatically. Scarcity? Solved. But if scarcity were truly gone, then why is Starfleet constantly short on ships? Why do its fleets stretch thin every time there's a crisis? Why does every major war expose supply chain weaknesses that shouldn't exist in a post-scarcity economy? There's a reason. Because post-scarcity was never the whole truth. This is the story of the shipyards behind Starfleet, the invisible empire that built the Federation's golden age, failed it during its darkest hours, collapsed twice in history, and still managed to rise again. If you want to understand Starfleet, you have to understand its forges. When the Federation formed in 2161, it inherited not an industrial superpower, but a patchwork of incompatible technologies and half-tested shipbuilding philosophies. Earth brought the NX program legacy, hard-won warp engineering but limited interstellar infrastructure. Vulcan brought efficiency-first design, but a culture resistant to large-scale military or exploratory expansion. Andoria brought rugged military craft built around endurance and survivability. Teller brought industrial mass production capability unmatched by any other founding world. And none of them fit neatly together. To make matters worse, the early Federation was not post-scarcity. In fact, if you rewatch 22nd to 23rd century material through an economic lens, something becomes very clear. People still used credits. Ships required budgets. Starfleet officers paid for goods and services. Resource allocation wasn't theoretical, it was political. Some later sources claim the Federation has no money at all, but in this era, the internal evidence strongly suggests a civilization transitioning rather than fully transformed. Under that interpretation, early Starfleet wasn't just technologically limited, it was economically constrained in ways future centuries wouldn't admit existed. You can't build a galaxy-spanning exploratory fleet when warp cores require extremely rare alloys you must mine or purchase. Antimatter production facilities are slow and fragile. Dilithium is scarce and poorly refined. Engineers are spread thin across incompatible technologies. And entire ship classes must be built by hand. Early Starfleet ships were effectively handcrafted naval vessels, labor-intensive, slow to produce, and dependent on artisanal engineering skill that took decades to cultivate. The Federation had a dream of unity, but not yet the industrial foundation to enforce or protect it. That changed on a red world just next door. The real industrial birth of Starfleet begins with the construction of Utopia Planitia fleet yards on Mars. Its advantages were unparalleled. It gave them access to raw materials from Deimos and Phobos. proximity to Earth, the administrative heart of the Federation, enough orbital space for exponential expansion, and environmental stability conducive to large-scale automation. Utopia Planitia represented something deeper than efficiency. It was the Federation finally thinking like a power, not just a coalition. This is the era of Starfleet's first true shipbuilding doctrine. The Constitution class wasn't just revolutionary because of its technology. It was revolutionary because of how it was built. Modular components, standardized warp cores, interchangeable internal systems, hull planing that could be mass fabricated across multiple facilities, and engineering schematics designed for replication and repetition. This is where the seeds of the future post-scarcity myth are planted. Not because scarcity disappeared, but because Starfleet built systems that reduced its impact. And yet, even now, true automation was limited. Replicators existed, but only in primitive industrial form. They could produce structural elements, but not refined exotic materials. They couldn't produce antimatter, nor stable dilithium. They couldn't produce components requiring precision subspace alignment. And they absolutely could not replicate the most crucial resource: the people with enough expertise to assemble and maintain starships. The Klingon Cold War further accelerated industrial expansion. By the 2250s, Starfleet began to resemble a true multi-system construction network. Earth Space Dock was expanded into a full metropolitan ship service hub. Antares shipyards began specializing in heavier hull assemblies. Vulcan contributed precision warp-filled calibration foundries. Teller oversaw mass production sub-assemblies. Andorian yards handled weapons integration and hull hardening. The Federation was becoming a superpower. It just wasn't yet willing to admit it. And when the Klingon threat suddenly dissolved into peace, the Federation made a decision it would come to regret. The Khitomer Accords and the explosion of Praxis rewrote the political landscape overnight. The Klingon Empire, once the Federation's greatest industrial rival, became a desperate ally in need of stabilization. The Federation's response? A sweeping demilitarization of Starfleet production. Ship contracts were reduced, construction timetables were lengthened, entire facilities were reallocated to civilian manufacturing. For the first time, the Federation believed its own rhetoric, that diplomacy, not industry, would keep it safe. This is also the era where the no money in the Federation myth becomes culturally dominant. But here's the truth. Even in this supposed moneyless era, credit still existed. Not for food, not for housing, not even for medicine, but for dilithium refinement, antimatter containment systems, trade with non-Federation powers, raw materials that cannot be replicated, and starship components sourced from private fabrication yards that still dealt with other powers. The Federation wasn't post-scarcity, it was post-consumer scarcity. But Starfleet was still trapped in the same economic reality every large military faces. If something can't be replicated, if something can't be automated, if it can't be acquired without expertise, then it's scarce. And in the late 23rd and early 24th centuries, everything Starfleet needed to build ships was scarce. This is also when you see the first major split between Starfleet-run shipyards and planetary yards owned by member governments. Planets like Corridon, Teller, Mars, Beta Antares, Andor, and Trill all had their own priorities. Starfleet had to negotiate for capacity, never command it. This tension would later become a fatal vulnerability. By the mid-24th century, Starfleet reaches its largest and most sophisticated industrial moment in history, the Galaxy-class project. The Galaxy-class project is the culmination of everything the Federation learned across 2 centuries. Multi-yard collaboration, standardized but massively scalable systems, enormous warp core production lines, precision antimatter containment fabrication, modular internal architecture, advanced automation, replicator-driven component manufacturing. But there was a catch. The Galaxy class took decades to plan and build because of its sheer complexity. Now, replicators could build these things. They could build interior components, make sure that plate segments were on right, definitely ensure the bulk structural elements were secured. But still, they couldn't replicate refined dilithium, active antimatter, warp-filled coils, certain exotic alloys, high-tolerance subspace cores, and industrial-grade warp plasma injectors. Even at its industrial peak, Starfleet faced 3 bottlenecks. Dilithium scarcity. As I've stated a couple of times, it can't be replicated. Refining it, yields are limited. Different sources have wildly different purity levels. They also had to account for antimatter production limits. Antimatter reactors require immense energy input and catastrophic risk control. Only certain worlds would host them, and output is finite. And above all that, what's worse is they had an expertise bottleneck. Post-scarcity can create matter, but not experience. The Federation needed warp engineers, fabricators, supervisors, and AI alignment specialists. Training takes decades. You never want to shortcut that. This is the era when Starfleet begins diversifying designs as well. You have things like the Nebula class, the best ship in the fleet, the Akira prototypes, the New Orleans, steam runner concepts. A more flexible doctrine emerges, but at the cost of standardization. And while the Federation doesn't realize it yet, this lack of standardization will become one of its greatest industrial vulnerabilities when the Dominion enters the stage. The 24th century represented Starfleet's industrial peak. Then, the Dominion War revealed how fragile that peak truly was. The Dominion industrial model was fundamentally different from the Federation's. It wasn't built for longevity. It wasn't built for exploration. It wasn't built for diplomacy. It was built for war. The Jem'Hadar were grown. The ships were stamped out. The command structure was centralized and absolute. The Dominion could produce soldiers, ships, and material at scales the Federation had never been forced to match. By contrast, Starfleet's vessels were masterpieces. They were elegant, versatile, they were over-engineered, and extraordinarily expensive to construct when you consider what they required. I'm specifically talking about time, expertise, rare materials, precision warp-filled assemblies, the things you can't just print out of a replicator. The war exposed this imbalance brutally. Utopia Planitia became a triage zone. Antares yards moved to full wartime footing. Outlying facilities were converted from civilian manufacturing to emergency starship production, often inefficiently. This is the hidden industrial story most people forget. Starfleet didn't own most shipyards. The Federation didn't centrally command them. Instead, they relied on partnerships with planetary governments and private orbital facilities. When the Dominion began pushing into the Alpha Quadrant space, a lot of the worlds redirected production to their own security forces. They would withhold skilled labor. They lobbied to delay Starfleet requisition, or outright reallocated antimatter shipments to local defense fleets. This forced Starfleet into constant negotiation. In wartime, negotiation within your own borders is often weakness. Under desperation, Starfleet rushed multiple new classes into service. I've talked about these a lot. You see the Intrepid retrofits, the Heavy Miranda resurrections, Excelsior refit overhauls, Norways, the Sovereign, all kinds of ships that were needed. This solved short-term needs, but at the cost of long-term logistical chaos. The Federation lost ships faster than Utopia Planitia could replace them. The Dominion's cloning-based workforce meant infinite labor. Starfleet's engineers were finite. And when expertise is your bottleneck, you cannot win an attrition war. In the end, the Federation survived through alliances, strategic ingenuity, and raw determination, not industrial superiority. But the war did leave scars. Scars that would reshape Starfleet's philosophy in ways the Federation wasn't ready to confront. After the war, the Alpha and Beta quadrants were exhausted. Starfleet assumed rebuilding its fleet would be straightforward. All you have to do is expand the shipyards, restaff the engineering corps, resume standardized production, and integrate lessons learned. But the political reality was far more complicated. Entire planetary economies were upended. Industrial capacity had been diverted away from civilian sectors for years. Worlds like Beta Z, Teller, Benzar, and Andor demanded Starfleet stand down. And the Federation Council sided with them. They argued Starfleet was too militarized, too large, too interventionist. Starfleet production slowed again, just as it had after the Khitomer Accords. Thousands of engineers were lost during the war. Warp-field specialists, antimatter experts, hull fabricators, entire generations of institutional knowledge had been wiped out. You can replicate food and bulkheads, but the knowledge base of a skilled workforce, that's a different story. On top of that, old refineries were aging. New ones couldn't be built fast enough. Dilithium quality varied wildly by source, and the Federation was not prioritizing mining expansion. Against this backdrop, Starfleet tried to modernize. But it was modernizing with a weakened infrastructure and a politically constrained mandate. The Federation believed the worst was behind them. They were wrong. No event in Federation history reshaped Starfleet's industrial capacity more completely than the attack on Mars. Before the attack, Utopia Planitia produced nearly half of all new starships. Mars orbiting drydocks handled final assembly for the largest vessels in service. Automated foundries refined exotic alloys at industrial scales, and synthetics oversaw complex workflows that organics simply couldn't manage efficiently. But after the attack, the largest shipyard complex in the Federation was destroyed. Tens of thousands of engineers and technicians were killed. The Romulan rescue fleet under construction was annihilated. Antimatter staging depots and warp core foundries were damaged beyond repair. And ultimately, drydocks collapsed. Space docks burned and fleet yards ruptured. And that's not even to mention the political aftershock. Every automated construction system, offline. Every AI-assisted assembly process, shut down. Every drone bay, automated welder, and fabricator, decommissioned. Tasks once handled by synthetics now required retraining, manual oversight, increased staffing, slower workflows, and riskier procedures. Mars wasn't just a disaster, it was an industrial reset. The Federation was unprepared for how catastrophic that reset would be. Without Mars, Starfleet's output collapsed. Without automation, Starfleet's efficiency evaporated. Without political will, the reconstruction stalled. The Federation began shrinking again. Slowly, quietly, and then dramatically. I'd argue this is the beginning of Starfleet's long decline. Across the early 25th century, Starfleet becomes a shadow of its former self. Instead of a unified industrial machine, Starfleet is forced to scatter production across small planetary yards, private contractors, refit-only facilities, outdated orbital shells, and improvised modular stations. No single yard could match what Utopia Planitia once delivered. This was not a creative choice, it was a survival necessity. If you had smaller ships, you needed fewer rare materials. They didn't consume as much antimatter. They were faster to assemble manually and required fewer specialist engineers. And the ships reflected this. In the era, Starfleet fielded Inquiry-class ships, Reliant variants, upgraded older hulls, mission-specific prototypes. Each class solved an immediate need, but created a long-term logistical headache. Political leaders pushed for a smaller footprint. Exploratory missions dwindled. Defensive posture dominated strategy. And at its lowest point, Starfleet was no longer a symbol of unity and progress. It had become an organization fighting to maintain relevance. The environment set the stage for Federation's greatest collapse, one that would unfold centuries later. But it also set the stage for Starfleet's greatest rebirth. By the early 25th century, small but significant changes signal a new direction. The synth ban was lifted, drone welders go back online, industrial replicators return to full operation, and AI-assisted warp core alignment resumed. The difference was immediate. The lessons from Mars is impossible to ignore. Never centralize your industrial heart again. Starfleet began constructing shipyards across multiple member worlds. It decentralized antimatter production. They were looking at training new engineering cohorts and rebuilding the Federation's exploration mandate. This is the beginning of recovery. But centuries later, something far greater happens. Warp travel collapses. Dilithium destabilizes. The galaxy fragments. The Federation becomes a memory. Starfleet loses everything. It loses its shipyards, its homeworlds, the political power. And yet, even then, in the farthest, darkest future, Starfleet rebuilds. And it didn't rebuild because it had shipyards, or replicators, or automation, but because of the one resource the Federation has always underestimated: the people who remember how to build starships. Knowledge becomes currency, expertise, power. Ingenuity becomes the foundation of a new industrial age. And slowly, painfully, across a fractured galaxy, Starfleet forges light up again. A new Federation forms, new Starfleet. A new age of exploration begins. The idea survived, and because the idea survived, the shipyards returned. The Federation likes to say it has no money, but that's not true. A starship has costs. I've said it a couple of times. Let's go through it one more time. Infrastructure, labor, people with expertise, time, political will, and you have to have, most critically, unity. You can replicate a warp coil housing. You can replicate a bulkhead. You can replicate the chair on the bridge, but you can't replicate an engineer who understands warp-filled harmonics, the political resolve to fund exploration, the industrial base that holds a civilization together, the institutional knowledge of generations of shipbuilders. You can't replicate the very culture that believes exploration is worth the cost. The Federation has collapsed twice. Its industrial heart has burned twice. And twice, Starfleet rose from the ashes. Because shipyards, they don't build Starfleet. Starfleet builds shipyards. As long as the Federation believes the stars are worth reaching, the forges will always reignite. And the galaxy, no matter how dark the century, will fill with starships once more.